Good evening and welcome to The Agenda, tonight brought to you from an independent Scotland. OK, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself there, but it sure does sometimes feel like that. The SNP surge is the political story of the year. So, a great moment to be here with Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland and leader of the SNP. Joining her on the panel, former ambassador to Washington and press secretary to John Major, Sir Christopher Mayer, actress and comedian Elaine C. Smith, a supporter of independence, though not a member of the SNP, and Tony Blair's former speechwriter, now a brilliant Times columnist, Phil Collins. So, it is the story of the moment. A charismatic woman is determined to break into the boys' club that holds a grip on power. You know what I'm talking about. Exactly. Game of Thrones is back. First, wherever you go in the UK at the moment, you can guarantee two political questions will grab a bit of attention. Scotland, what on earth is going on? And Labour and the SNP. Wow, seriously? What would that actually mean? Let's deal with the big I question first. Is Scottish independence only a matter of time? Nicola, would you agree it's inevitable that if you do as well as people are saying that you will do, and it has to be said the polls are kind of in your favour, do you think you will inevitably have to go for another referendum at some point in the next 2 or 3 years?
No, not as a result of the Westminster election. I mean, Elaine's absolutely right. Scotland does accept the outcome of the referendum. I think what people in Scotland are more reluctant to accept is that Scotland post-referendum should simply go back to being seen and not heard within the Westminster system. The election on May the 7th is not about independence. If you vote for the SNP on May the 7th, you're not voting for independence, you're not even voting for another independence referendum. You're voting to make Scotland's voice heard in that system that has so often in the past tended to sideline and ignore Scotland. In the future, whether or not there's another referendum on independence is not up to me. I think Scotland will become independent one day. I think that's the direction of travel. But it's not me that will decide that. There'll only be another referendum if people want that and there's enough public support for that. And we'll only ever be independent if a majority of people in Scotland decide to vote for that.
What clearer sign can you get that people really want it than you doing what the polls suggest you're currently going to do, which is sweep the board in Scotland?
But I'm, you know, as the leader of the SNP, I'm saying very clearly to people, voting SNP in this election is not voting for another independence referendum. No, so I would not take that as any kind of mandate for another referendum. I've said very clearly that in order for there to be another referendum, people would have to vote for a party that had that as a proposal in a manifesto in a Scottish Parliament election. Okay. Now, that's not me saying it will be in the next SNP manifesto for the Scottish Parliament, but that's the lock there is on there being another referendum. I described it as a triple lock. I think for the SNP to put it in another manifesto, there has to be a change of circumstances from last year. Then people have to vote for that manifesto. And then if they do, and there is a referendum, people have to vote for independence.
Let's bring in. We'll come on to potential. I just want to, before we end this discussion, I want to bring on to one question that some people would see as a bridge to independence. You talked about full fiscal autonomy. And I'm just interested to know what you really think that would end up being like. They've talked about the £7.6 billion gap in spending it would open up. And if you borrowed more, how would you do that? How would it actually work?
Well, the £7.6 billion is a complete red herring. I mean, that's a figure that the IFS have put forward for Scotland's fiscal position this year. It would take no account of the fiscal agreement and framework that would require to be negotiated.
But you would have to borrow unless you wanted to tax more.
Well, Scotland's fiscal position is improving. Full fiscal autonomy, even if we could agree on it this year, would take several years to fully implement. You know, the very limited tax powers that are coming to Scotland that were agreed in 2009 don't actually take effect until next year. What I would argue is that we would argue for the powers first that would allow us to grow our economy more effectively so we can accelerate that.
Well, I'm asking this.
But deficits.
Yes, but no, they do. But I'm trying. Hold on a second. I'm just trying to ask this from a spirit, not trying to put you on the spot. I'm just trying to ask this from a spirit of genuine inquiry. If you will have this gap at least for a bit. You will have to borrow, and I'm just interested to know how that would be ultimately underwritten by UK-wide fiscal institutions.
That would be part of the fiscal framework that would have to be negotiated, but full fiscal autonomy would come with borrowing powers. But, you know, the £7.6 billion figure is one we shouldn't get fixated on. You know, there's lots of different
I'm just keen to know whether that borrowing would be underwritten by the UK.
That would be one of the things that would required to be negotiated. There would be a number of things that would require to be negotiated, not least what Scotland's contribution to defence would be, what our contribution to debt interest payments would be.
Okay. Well, that is a perfect move. That's a perfect move.
Because we would require to make contributions to the UK government for things that were continuing to be done on a reserve basis.
This is the perfect moment to move on to the next part of our discussion. Now, okay, just on the question of vote by vote, though, because the interesting thing is that a lot of the political parties, the small political parties, all of them, in fact, are talking not about coalitions, not even necessarily about confidence and supply, but vote by vote. And is there any reason why that actually shouldn't work?
I'm so old, I lived through this in 1974 when Harold Wilson, in the first election that year, tried to get along. They weren't even called Lib Dems then, what were they called? Liberals.
Liberals.
With the Liberal Party. And it was so rackety, and it had to have called another election 6 months later.
There's no need to worry about the nuclear question if it's a case-by-case basis, because there's a strong majority in the House of Commons for the retention of the nuclear deterrent. So on that basis, it wouldn't disappear anyway.
Can I make I suppose a couple of contextual points here. Firstly, I was the deputy leader of a minority government in Scotland for 4 years. Minority government can be stable, it can be effective, and it can be successful. We've proven that, and therefore, I guess we know how to contribute to making minority government work. The second point is picking up on a point Phil made entirely understandably, that how could Labour work with a party that was committed to Scottish independence? Well, I make no secret of the fact I believe in Scottish independence. But I'm also very firm in my view that as long as Scotland remains part of the Westminster system, it really matters to people in Scotland that the decisions made at Westminster are good decisions. So we've got a vested interest, as long as we're part of that system, in trying to make it work as well as possible. And, Elaine's point as well, many of the things I believe in, the SNP believe in, progressive politics, an alternative to austerity, the fact that public services shouldn't be privatised. There are many people across England, Wales and Northern Ireland that believe in these things as well.
Do you think people will always mistrust your motives, though, because you are ultimately committed to the split up?
Well, I guess I take some of the responsibility of trying to persuade them not to. I can understand why some people would. But what I'm trying to do is say, look, here is a hand of friendship. I'm not being secretive about my support for independence, but Scotland didn't vote to be independent. And as Elaine said, the politicians who tried to persuade Scotland to vote no said, your voice really matters within the UK, we want you to make a contribution. And it seems now to not really be fair to turn around and say we didn't mean that.
Labour launched its manifesto today. How much of it can you support?
I've not had a chance to read all of it, but I would want to see...
You may need to before May the 7th, but anyway, that's good.
I will read it long before May the 7th, but I've not yet had a chance to read it in full today, although I've seen some of the edited highlights. I'm being very clear, I don't think the country can afford more austerity, and Labour, said very clearly today that Labour would introduce more cuts.
Would that mean you wouldn't vote for a budget? Would you vote down a budget?
I would want to see... I'm not going into this with the intention of bringing down governments.
No, but a budget's a fundamental part of it.
Yeah, sure, but what I would be seeking to do is build alliances with parties like Plaid Cymru and the Greens, with Labour backbenchers who I know some of these people who prefer the SNP's view to economic policy than the view of the Labour leadership.
But have you not somewhat tied your hands in terms of the SNP's influence by saying you won't support the Tories, therefore you can only support Labour, therefore they can effectively, as Ed says, do whatever they like and you can't do anything about it?
I'm taking a view that I know might be unusual for politicians. I've just been honest. I could never, ever support a Tory government.
You'll never go anywhere, Nicola. Honestly, it's never going to work. Being honest, whatever.
But I could never support a Tory government. I grew up in the west of Scotland when Mrs Thatcher was Prime Minister and saw firsthand the damage she did to the community I grew up in. I think Tory governments are bad for Scotland. I think they're bad for
OK, but just to be clear, what that means,
well.
though, in practice, that means you could never vote down a Labour budget.
Well, look, but this is where my experience of being the deputy leader of minority government is important, because minority government is all about building alliances on an issue-by-issue basis. It's not about going in and saying we're going to bring you down. It's about saying where can I find support across this Parliament for the position that I want to prevail on, and building those progressive alliances. And on some of the issues we're talking about, I know there would be a lot of support on Labour's backbenches for some of these positions. So it's constructive, and it is about
Liberal
trying
Democrats
to...
as well. Don't forget,
and about trying to bring about constructive, progressive change.
But can I just say, I think the Scottish population who are finally being spoken about in a Westminster election, which generally we are, and Trident generally isn't an issue either.
Because they've always been run by Scots, that's why.
Well, not always,
Scottish Prime Ministers.
Well, too, but
very recently.
But it never felt like that from here. Can I tell you that? But I don't think the Scottish people would be in any way interested in sending all these SNP MPs down there if, in fact, that's what happened, to wreck the place.
Isn't the great unmentioned in this debate that we still have a deficit every year of 90 billion quid? We've got debt clocking through 1.5 trillion, and we're paying 47 billion pounds a year in interest.
The SNP are putting forward
you won't be reducing it, will you?
No, we will. We're putting forward an alternative plan for modest spending increases over the life of the next Parliament of 0.5% in real terms a year. The deficit still reduces, the debt still reduces as a share of national income. It would take 2 or 3 years longer to completely eliminate the deficit under that plan. But I look at what's happened in the past 5 years, and I look at the Tory and Labour spending plans, and I see spending plans that will, just as has happened over the last 5 years, penalise a lot of vulnerable and poor people.
Okay, I understand that, but just to be clear,
services.
so you would rule out a year-by-year cut in the deficit, as Labour have said? You would rule out committing to that?
I think, under what I'm proposing, the deficit as a share of income will reduce year on year.
By the end of the Parliament?
But
you're talking about the overall trajectory. They're talking about a year-by-year.
What I'm proposing, the deficit would reduce year by year, but it would take longer to completely eliminate. So it would take 2 or 3 years beyond the end of the next Parliament to completely eliminate the deficit. Now, I think that's a price worth paying for some investment in public services, for some investment in the things that get economy
Final question,
growing.
and then we need to move on. Are you happy with spending £47 billion a year in interest?
Nobody should be happy about having the debt that successive Westminster governments have racked up. But the question is now, how do you reduce and eliminate that responsibly in a way that doesn't heap pain and more pain on some of the most vulnerable people? The 10% poorest in our society have been hardest hit by austerity. It's making it harder to protect our public services. All of the economic experts say austerity has actually held back economic growth. So it's not even George Osborne missed all of his own fiscal targets. So let's do it a bit more responsibly.
Okay, we need to move on now.
It was interesting.
Nicola, what piece of advice did your friend Alex Salmond, ex-leader, give to you? What's the best piece of advice he's ever given you?
He actually, probably the best piece of advice he gave me was, this is him saying to me, ask me for advice when you want to and when you need to. I'm not going to force it upon you, and he never does. I do from time to time, yeah, and I always will. I agree with Phil. I think I agree that it's probably not the means to do it. But speaking as a current leader, to be deprived of the wealth of experience that your predecessors in the job have had, I think would be a big mistake. And I think as a current leader, I will, give myself a good kick up the backside if I ever find myself thinking, I'm not going to Alex Salmond for advice, because that would be admitting somehow that I needed his advice. I think there's a wealth of experience there that, for people in the job now, you need to be able to access. You need to have the confidence to be able to access that as well.
You must occasionally grit your teeth at some of his interviews where he seems to enjoy winding people up.
As long as it's other people he's winding up and not me, it's absolutely fine.
Are you saying that all his interventions are always helpful?
Look, Alec, that moment of hesitation there.
Yeah. This is going well, Nicola. Keep going,
Alec is a major asset.
Yeah.
He's a major asset to the SNP. I think he's a big, big asset to Scotland. And, he's got a particularly direct way of saying things. And I wouldn't change a single thing about how he does things, because, it goes back to something Christopher said earlier on about the SNP. If we're in numbers in the House of Commons, we'll become the establishment. Actually, what the SNP has shown is that it is possible to have political power without becoming the establishment, because you have conviction, you stand up for your beliefs, and
you don't go in the House of Lords
for people. Well, get rid of the House of Lords completely.
Well, there we are. Well, that's very good. Nicola?
I'm feeling a bit mean about mine now, since Elaine's is so nice about it. But I think I'm about to rain on Nick Clegg's parade, though. My tuition fees whopper was this big. It must be the biggest broken election promise ever, and probably why I think he's not heading back to the Cabinet Office.
Do you think he will do better than people say?
I don't know. I don't, actually.
Well, there you have it.
That's for the voters to
Maybe
decide.
not a surprise. Now, that's all we have time for tonight.